Emily Carter had never imagined that one ordinary morning in her quiet Kansas town would change the entire direction of her life. She woke to the sound of the wind rushing through the open fields, the same sound she'd heard every morning for 22 years. The routine had become almost unbearable. Her job at the grocery store. The same faces, the same small talk, the same feeling that her life was on pause while everyone else's was moving forward. Her father used to say she was born for something steady, simple, safe. But Emily didn't want safe. She wanted meaning. The idea of joining the army had first entered her mind a year ago, when she watched a news report about a group of American soldiers rescuing civilians overseas. Something about their faces stayed with her, dusty, exhausted, yet filled with a kind of purpose she'd never known. She began reading stories about women in uniform, learning how they were changing the image of what strength looked like. It wasn't about power or pride. It was about being part of something bigger than herself. And one night, while her parents slept, Emily filled out the enlistment form online. The next morning, she sat at the breakfast table, waiting for the courage to speak. Her father looked up from his newspaper, noticed her fidgeting, and asked, "What's wrong?" She swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I joined the army," she said. The words felt too heavy for the room. Her mother froze mid-bite, her fork clinking against the plate. "You did what?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily repeated herself, trying to sound confident, though she wasn't sure she was. Her father set the paper down slowly, studying her face. "You're serious about this?" he asked. "You don't even like camping, Emily. How are you going to survive boot camp?" She forced a small smile. "I'll learn," she said. But deep down, fear curled inside her like a shadow. The weeks leading up to her departure were filled with tension. Friends called her brave, but their eyes said something else, maybe confusion, maybe disbelief. Her best friend, Sarah, tried to convince her to stay. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Sarah said. "You're smart. You can do college, travel, anything." But Emily only shook her head. "I'm not trying to prove anything," she whispered. "I just need to feel like I'm part of something real." When the day finally came, her parents drove her to the bus station. Her mother hugged her for too long, whispering prayers under her breath. Her father tried to look proud, but the worry in his eyes betrayed him. As the bus doors closed, Emily watched them through the glass until they disappeared. She felt the weight of goodbye pressing on her chest, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Boot camp was everything she expected, and nothing she could have prepared for. The moment she stepped off the bus, a wall of heat and shouting hit her. Drill sergeants barked orders so fast she barely understood them. "Move, recruit." Eyes forward. "You think this is a vacation?" Every word was a storm. By nightfall, she was drenched in sweat, her muscles screaming, her hands shaking as she tried to remember how to breathe. But amid the chaos, something in her shifted. She wasn't running away from fear anymore. She was learning to run through it. The days blurred together, marching before sunrise, endless drills, blistered feet, aching shoulders. Recruits broke down around her, some crying quietly at night, others quitting altogether. Emily thought about quitting too, more than once. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's doubtful look, her mother's trembling hands, her own reflection staring back in that tiny Kansas bathroom mirror. "Don't quit," she whispered to herself. "Not now." One morning, during weapons training, she nearly failed her first shooting qualification. The recoil shocked her, her aim off, her confidence slipping. The drill sergeant, a grizzled man with eyes like stone, stepped beside her. "You're flinching," he said flatly. "You scared of the sound?" She didn't answer. He adjusted her stance, forced her to steady her breathing. "You either control the weapon, or it controls you. Your choice. The next shot hit the center of the target. Then another. By the end of the session, she was breathing differently, deeper, calmer, stronger. For the first time, she realized that courage wasn't loud. It was steady. Nights in the barracks were strange. After lights out, when the room grew quiet except for the hum of air vents, Emily listened to the whispers of other recruit stories, of homes left behind, lovers waiting, parents disapproving. She felt connected to them in a way she never had with anyone before. They were strangers, but they were also her mirrors. They all carried something inside they were trying to fix or prove. She began to talk too, slowly at first, telling stories about Kansas, her dog, the storms that used to roll across the fields. They laughed. For the first time since she arrived, Emily felt she belonged. Weeks passed, and something remarkable happened. She began to change. Her posture straightened. Her voice grew firmer. She could run longer, lift heavier, think clearer. The girl who once doubted herself was being replaced by someone who didn't flinch when yelled at, who didn't hesitate when told to lead a drill. There was pride in her chest now, a quiet one that didn't need validation. She earned it every sunrise she survived. Graduation day came like sunlight after a storm. Standing in formation under the American flag, Emily's heart pounded not from fear, but from a fierce, burning pride. The brass band played, medals glimmered, families cheered. She spotted her parents in the crowd, her mother waving, her father clapping with watery eyes. In that moment, everything she had endured felt worth it. She wasn't the small-town girl with restless dreams anymore. She was Private Emily Carter, U.S. Army. After the ceremony, her father hugged her for the first time without words. "You did it," he whispered. She nodded, holding back tears. She had done it. But as the bus carried her toward her next assignment, she looked out the window at the fading sky and felt a strange unease. She didn't know where she would go next, only that the world was about to grow much bigger and much darker than she'd ever imagined. She closed her eyes, the rhythm of the road humming beneath her boots, and whispered a silent promise to prove herself not just to others, but to the memory of who she used to be. She was just a recruit now, but soon she would learn what it meant to be a soldier and how every moment of courage comes with a price no one warns you about. The first thing Emily noticed when she arrived at the base overseas was the heat. It was relentless, like standing too close to an open oven that never cooled. The sun didn't shine. It burned. Dust clung to her uniform, her boots, her eyelashes. The air smelled of sand, sweat, and metal. She stepped off the truck with the other soldiers, squinting through the haze as helicopters thumped in the distance. For the first time, she realized she wasn't in Kansas anymore. She was standing in the middle of a war zone. Her unit was stationed at a forward operating base, a cluster of beige tents surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. It wasn't much to look at, but for the soldiers, it was home. Emily dragged her duffel bag into the barracks and was immediately greeted by a voice behind her. "You're the new recruit from Kansas, right?" Turning around, she met a tall, broad-shouldered medic with sandy hair and a grin that could survive a sandstorm. "Name's Avery. Don't worry, the heat stops feeling like hell after the first 3 weeks," he said. Emily smiled awkwardly, unsure if he was joking. 3 weeks? That's encouraging. He laughed. "Yeah, well, it never really gets better. You just stop caring." Within days, she met the rest of her small squad. There was Rodriguez, a calm, steady man with dark eyes and a wedding ring that he fiddled with whenever he talked about home. He had 2 kids and carried their photos in the breast pocket of his uniform. "They're why I'm still alive," he said once with a half-smile. Then there was Jenna, the sniper, sharp-tongued, fearless, and fast. She could take apart a rifle faster than Emily could tie her boots. And finally, there was Daniels, the team leader. Quiet, composed, the kind of man who never raised his voice, but somehow made everyone listen. Together, they formed a strange kind of family, a family born from orders, discipline, and shared vulnerability. Their days were long but structured patrols in the morning, equipment checks, radio updates, training drills. The work kept their minds busy, which was a blessing. But it was the nights that truly bonded them. After sunset, when the air cooled and the camp lights flickered on, they would sit together outside the barracks, trading stories and laughter. Avery told wild tales about his failed college days. Rodriguez bragged about his daughter's school play. Jenna shared stories about her high school track mates. And Emily, at first shy, began telling them about Kansas. She spoke of wheat fields that stretched forever, of thunderstorms that rolled in like gods, of the quiet hum of summer crickets. They listened, smiling, teasing her for her small-town drawl, but their eyes softened. Out here, home was a fragile memory they all clung to. Each story made them human again, if only for a while. Life on base was a rhythm of monotony and tension. Some days passed without incident. Others erupted in brief chaos. They would go on patrol, scanning roads for IEDs, searching villages, meeting locals who smiled, but whose eyes always carried something uncertain. Emily learned quickly to read faces, to trust instincts more than appearances. The first time a child ran up to their convoy, waving, Emily waved back until Daniels barked at her to stop. "Never assume," he warned. "Even kindness can hide danger." It was a cruel lesson, but a necessary one. Despite the danger, Emily found moments of peace. She began keeping a small notebook scribbling thoughts, sketches, half-formed memories. Sometimes she wrote letters to her parents, but rarely mailed them. She didn't want them to worry about the things she couldn't say, the gunfire in the distance, the fear that lingered like a shadow, the weight of a rifle that now felt like an extension of her arm. One evening, after a long patrol, the team gathered around a small metal table in the mess tent. The lights flickered from the generator's hum. Avery dealt out cards, grinning like a man who'd found joy in the middle of chaos. "Loser has to clean weapons tomorrow," he said. "That means you, rookie?" Emily laughed, her shoulders easing for the first time that day. The game turned into jokes, the jokes into stories, and for a brief hour, the war outside the wire didn't exist. They were just friends, young and alive, clinging to something normal in a world that wasn't. Later that night, as the others drifted off to their bunks, Emily stayed awake, lying on her cot and staring at the tent ceiling. The generator buzzed softly. She thought about the people she'd met, their strength, their humor, their fragility. These weren't the soldiers she'd seen in movies. They were real, flawed, tired. They missed home. They cried sometimes when no one was looking. And still, every morning, they put their boots on and did it all again. That quiet resilience fascinated her. It gave her hope. But beneath that hope was something else, fear. Fear that this fragile peace couldn't last forever. That something terrible was always waiting beyond the next mission. Her first close call came just weeks later. Their convoy was traveling along a narrow dirt road when the lead vehicle stopped suddenly. Daniels raised a hand. IED possible. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every second stretched longer than time itself. Emily's palms were slick with sweat as she gripped her rifle, eyes scanning the endless tan horizon. A single crow circled above, black against gold. When the bomb squad finally confirmed the road was clear, the relief was dizzying. She exhaled shakily, realizing she'd been holding her breath for nearly 2 minutes. That night, Jenna nudged her at dinner. "You did good," she said simply. Emily nodded, unsure how to respond. It wasn't bravery she'd felt out there. It was sheer, desperate survival. In the following weeks, Emily began to notice subtle changes in herself. She moved differently, thought differently. The nervous recruit who had arrived with wide eyes was slowly replaced by someone alert, efficient, aware of danger, even in silence. She could sense when tension thickened in the air, when something felt off. Her instincts sharpened, and so did her resolve. Yet the emotional toll was heavy. Sometimes she caught herself staring at Rodriguez's family photos, wondering if he'd make it home to see them again. Other times, she watched Avery crack jokes in the middle of chaos and wondered how he managed to keep light alive in such darkness. She admired them, all these ordinary people, doing extraordinary things just to get through another day. Weeks turned into months. The desert changed with the seasons, less scorching, more cold at night. Emily found herself waking before dawn, stepping outside to watch the sun crawl up over the horizon, painting the sky in red and gold. It reminded her of Kansas, of mornings before everything changed. She'd close her eyes, breathe deeply, and whisper, "One more day. Just one more." Then she'd grab her gear and get ready for whatever came next. The friendships she built in those months became her armor. They laughed through fear, cursed through exhaustion, and somehow, through it all, they lived. Rodriguez teased her about her handwriting. Jenna gave her shooting tips that made her sharper. Avery made her laugh until she cried. And Daniels watched them all with the quiet care of a leader who carried the weight of every life under his command. It was the bond between them that made every hardship bearable. They weren't just a squad, they were a heartbeat, each one keeping the others alive. And though Emily didn't know it yet, that bond would soon be tested in ways that would change her forever. Because in war, moments of peace are only the calm before the storm. And for Emily Carter, the recruit, who had finally found her place, the storm was coming faster than she could imagine. The morning started like any other, sun blazing, dust swirling, radios crackling with static. Emily woke before dawn, her body trained to rise at the sound of the generator humming outside the barracks. She rubbed her tired eyes, tied her boots, and checked her rifle, the routine movements calming her nerves. Rodriguez passed by her bunk, coffee in hand. "Another hot day in paradise," he said, smiling faintly. She chuckled, adjusting her helmet. "Can't wait." Their mission that day was simple escort, a supply convoy to a nearby village. Simple. That word had lost its meaning out here. Every mission, no matter how small, carried the shadow of danger. But they went anyway, because that's what soldiers do. By 0700 hours, their Humvees rolled out of the gate, engines rumbling across the desert road. Emily sat in the rear vehicle, her eyes scanning the endless stretch of sand. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, too calm, too quiet. She adjusted her earpiece and listened to the chatter between vehicles. Avery cracked jokes over the radio. Jenna teased him back, and even Daniels let out a low chuckle. For a moment, it felt almost normal, like a strange road trip through hell. Then the world exploded. It began with a sound sharp, metallic, unnatural. The ground shook violently as a blast tore through the lead vehicle, engulfing it in flames. "I'd. Someone shouted over the radio. Smoke billowed into the air, black and choking. Emily's heart stopped. Everything moved in fragments. Daniels yelling orders, Avery grabbing his medkit, the ringing in her ears deafening her. Gunfire erupted from the ridge to their right. Dust kicked up around them as bullets sliced through the air. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a heartbeat, her mind went blank, just white noise and terror. Then, instinct took over. She dove behind the vehicle, pressing her body against the scorching metal. Her training screamed through her panic breath. Aim, return fire. She raised her rifle, sighted the ridge, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted her shoulder, but she didn't stop. Suppressive fire. Daniels shouted. "Rodriguez, get the wounded out." Avery sprinted forward through the haze, dragging a bleeding soldier by his vest. Emily covered him, firing bursts toward the ridge. Her hands trembled, sweat stung her eyes, but she kept shooting. She didn't even know if she hit anything. She just knew that stopping wasn't an option. Another explosion thundered, this time closer. The shockwave threw her to the ground, knocking the wind out of her. Sand filled her mouth, her ears ringing so loud it felt like silence. When she lifted her head, she saw the second vehicle burning, a dark silhouette crumpled beside it. Time seemed to slow, every sound distant, every breath heavy. "Carter, move!" Daniel's voice snapped her back. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed her rifle, and ran toward the downed soldier. It was Private Lewis, one of the newer guys, his face pale, leg mangled. Emily's stomach turned, but she knelt beside him, pressing her hands to the wound. "You're okay, you're okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. Avery appeared beside her, blood smeared across his hands. "Pressure here," he instructed quickly, his voice calm but tight. Together they worked, their movements automatic, mechanical. The chaos around them felt distant, just noise and flashes of light. Finally, the gunfire began to fade. The attackers retreated as reinforcements arrived, vehicles roaring from the base. The firefight had lasted less than 10 minutes, but to Emily, it felt like an eternity. When the dust settled, she looked around. The desert was littered with debris, smoke still rising from the burning vehicle. Medics rushed between the wounded, shouting over the static of radios. The smell of fuel and burnt metal hung heavy in the air. Emily's chest ached from breathing too fast, too hard. Her hands were slick with blood that wasn't hers. She stood frozen, rifle still clutched in her hands, staring at the bodies being covered with tarps. 2 soldiers from the lead vehicle hadn't made it. Rodriguez walked up behind her, his face pale, his voice low. "We lost Ramirez and Cole." The names hit her like a blow. She'd eaten breakfast with them just that morning. She didn't realize she was shaking until Avery gently took the rifle from her hands. "Hey," he said softly, his voice stripped of humor for the first time. "It's over. You're okay." But she wasn't, not really. She nodded anyway, because that's what soldiers did. Back at the base, silence replaced the usual laughter. The mess tent was half empty that night. Plates sat untouched. Even the air felt heavier, as if the desert itself was mourning. Emily sat alone at one of the tables, her untouched food growing cold. Every sound, the clatter of trays, the distant hum of machinery felt sharp, intrusive. She stared at her trembling hands, stained faintly pink despite washing them 3 times. Jenna slid onto the bench across from her. "You did good today," she said quietly. Emily didn't answer. Her throat was dry, her heart still pounding hours after the battle. "You kept your head," Jenna continued. "That's more than some can say their first time." Emily looked up, her eyes hollow. "They're gone," she said softly. "Ramirez, Cole. They were right there." Jenna nodded. "Yeah, they were." She leaned back, her gaze distant. "You'll never forget it, Carter. None of us do. But you'll learn to carry it." That night, Emily lay in her bunk, unable to sleep. The generator's hum felt too loud, the shadows too alive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes, the explosion, the smoke, the lifeless faces. She sat up, clutching her knees to her chest, trying not to cry. But the tears came anyway, silent and hot. She buried her face in her hands and let them fall, her shoulders shaking. For the first time, she understood what war really meant. It wasn't medals, glory, or the cinematic heroism she once imagined. It was loss. Sudden, merciless, irreversible loss. At dawn she walked outside, the desert still wrapped in gray light. The sky was painted with streaks of pink and gold, beautiful and cruel in its calm. She stared out across the horizon where the firefight had taken place, now eerily quiet. Daniels approached from behind. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. Didn't even try. He stood beside her, silent for a long moment. "You did what you had to do," he said finally. "You kept people alive. That's all any of us can do." Emily looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't feel like enough." He sighed. "It never does." They stood there in silence, two figures in the half-light, both carrying the same invisible weight. When the sun finally rose, Emily squared her shoulders and took a deep breath. She didn't feel brave. She felt broken. But beneath that brokenness was something else, something raw, defiant, unyielding. Fear was no longer the same. It had shape now, a face she'd seen up close. And though it haunted her, it also hardened her. She was no longer the recruit who dreamed of purpose. She was a soldier who had faced death, and now had to live with it. As she walked back toward the barracks, the wind carried a whisper across the sand. Maybe it was her imagination, or maybe it was the voices of those she'd lost. Either way, she promised herself one thing. Their names would never fade from her memory. Because the war had spoken its first cruel word, and Emily Carter had finally heard it. The days after the ambush blurred together, time bleeding into one endless stretch of heat and silence. The desert never stopped, neither did the missions. There were no pauses for grief and war. Orders still came, convoys still rolled out, and the air still smelled of dust and diesel. Emily woke each morning before the sun, her body moving through the same motions boots. Rifle, vest, helmet-like muscle memory had taken control. But something inside her had shifted. The laughter that once echoed through the barracks had dulled. Even Avery's jokes, the kind that used to make her smirk, now fell flat. At first, she tried to keep count of the days since the attack. 1 week, 2, but eventually she stopped. Time didn't feel real anymore. The calendar on the wall might as well have belonged to another world. Out here, the only measure of time was how long it had been since the last explosion, the last shot fired, the last friend lost. It was during one of their supply runs that the silence finally broke. Rodriguez was driving, Emily manning the gun turret. The wind whipped through her helmet straps, sand stinging her eyes. She scanned the horizon, the rifle steady in her hands. Every glint of light made her heart jolt, every distant figure a possible threat. "You ever think about home?" Rodriguez asked through the headset, his voice crackling with static. Emily hesitated. "Sometimes. What about it?" She didn't answer right away. The image of her mother's kitchen came to mind, the chipped coffee mug, the ticking clock on the wall, the smell of cinnamon. Ordinary things that felt almost sacred now. "The quiet," she said finally. "I miss the quiet." Rodriguez chuckled softly. "Can't argue with that. Out here, even silence feels loud." They drove on, and for a moment, the air between them felt lighter. But then she caught sight of something half buried in the sand-charred helmet, glinting faintly in the sun, and the weight returned, pressing hard on her chest. That night, she sat alone behind the barracks, the desert wind carrying the faint hum of generators. The stars above seemed endless, cold, and distant, like the world itself had moved on without them. She pulled out her notebook, the one she'd started before deployment, its pages half filled with training notes and doodles. Now she began writing names instead: Ramirez, Cole, Lewis, and next to them, short lines, memories, moments, fragments. Ramirez's crooked grin. Cole's habit of humming old country songs. Lewis's nervous laugh. She wrote until her hand cramped. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't healing. But it kept her from forgetting. The next morning, Daniels found her near the shooting range, firing at a target long after the others had stopped. Sweat soaked her uniform, her breathing harsh through gritted teeth. "You're gonna burn out the barrel at this rate," he said. She lowered her rifle, chest rising and falling. "I need to get better." He studied her for a long moment. "You're already good." "Not good enough," she muttered. Daniels stepped closer, his voice quiet. "You think shooting straighter's gonna stop what happened?" Her jaw tightened. "It'll stop it from happening again." He didn't argue. He just nodded and walked away, leaving her alone with the sound of the wind and her own heavy breathing. Over time, Emily's aim did improve. Her instincts sharpened. She learned to read the terrain, to spot trouble before it came. Fear never left her, but it became part of her, an old companion whispering in her ear. Weeks passed. Missions blurred together checkpoints, patrols, brief clashes that began and ended before she could even register them. The rhythm of war was cruel in its consistency. But amidst that chaos, small moments began to shine through. One afternoon, Avery managed to rig a satellite connection strong enough to stream a baseball game. Half the platoon crowded around the tiny screen, shouting, laughing, arguing over teams. Emily sat in the corner, watching them, not the game, but the faces. For the first time in weeks, she saw something resembling joy. Fragile, fleeting, but real. Jenna noticed her watching. "You can join, you know," she said with a smirk. "We're not charging admission." Emily smiled faintly. "I'll pass." "Not much of a sports fan." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "You just don't remember how to have fun." Emily's smile faded. "Maybe." But that night, when the generator failed and the entire camp went dark, Emily sat outside with Jenna and Avery under the stars. They passed around a dented can of peaches someone had been saving. Avery cracked a joke about five-star dining in the apocalypse, and for the first time since the firefight, Emily actually laughed. It was soft, quick, but it was real. The laughter died down, replaced by the low murmur of conversation. Jenna glanced at Emily. "You ever wonder if any of this will mean something when it's over?" Emily thought about it. "I think it has to," she said. "Otherwise, why are we here?" No one answered. The wind filled the silence, carrying the faint smell of oil and sand. A week later, the platoon received new orders relocate to a forward operating base deeper into the region. It was riskier, more isolated. Daniels gathered them for briefing, the dim light casting long shadows on his tired face. "We'll move out at dawn," he said. "Pack light, stay sharp." Emily packed her gear that night, tucking her notebook carefully into her rucksack. As she zipped it closed, she caught her reflection in the small mirror by her bunk. The face staring back was harder, now eyes darker, jaw set. She barely recognized herself. When morning came, they rolled out in a convoy of dust and noise. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the horizon shimmering with heat. Emily sat in the back seat, rifle resting against her knee, heart steady but heavy. Halfway through the drive, Rodriguez spoke again over the headset. "You've changed, Carter." She looked out the window, watching the dunes blur by. "So have you." He chuckled. "Yeah, but you. You used to flinch at every loud noise. Now you barely blink." "That's not a good thing," she said quietly. "Maybe not," he replied. "But it keeps you alive." His words lingered long after the conversation ended. By evening, they reached the new base, a cluster of tents and concrete barriers surrounded by miles of barren land. It felt smaller, more exposed. As Emily stepped out, the hot wind hit her like a wall. She glanced around, new faces, unfamiliar terrain, another place to survive. Later that night, as the sun bled into the horizon, she climbed to the lookout tower. From up there, the world looked endless. For the first time, she felt something stir inside her resolve. Not the naive kind she'd had when she first arrived, but a deeper one, born from loss and endurance. She whispered the names from her notebook into the wind: Ramirez, Cole, Lewis, like a promise. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew this much. She wasn't fighting just for orders anymore. She was fighting for memory. For them. Below her, the camp lights flickered on, faint but steady against the darkening sky. Emily took a deep breath, adjusted her rifle strap, and stared into the coming night. War had taken much from her, but it hadn't taken everything. Not yet. The new base was smaller, quieter, and somehow heavier. The walls felt closer, the air thicker with exhaustion and suspicion. Every face looked worn, new recruits pretending they weren't terrified, veterans pretending they weren't broken. Emily found herself somewhere in between, not a rookie anymore, but not yet hardened enough to feel untouchable. She had begun to lead small units on patrols through the villages scattered across the desert. The locals didn't smile much anymore. Some nodded politely. Others turned away. The line between safety and hostility blurred a little more each day. The children no longer waved when the convoys passed. That silence, that watchfulness, it was worse than gunfire. One afternoon, during a reconnaissance patrol, Daniels received orders through the radio. Intel suggested insurgent activity near a remote farmhouse a few miles east. The team moved out cautiously, dust trailing behind their vehicles like ghosts. Emily sat behind the gun mount again, scanning the endless stretch of land. The heat distorted everything, turning the horizon into a trembling mirage. As they approached the farmhouse, something didn't feel right. The place looked abandoned, no movement, no animals, no signs of life. Avery checked his scanner, frowning. "Nothing on thermal," he muttered. Daniels ordered a perimeter check. Emily dismounted, rifle at the ready, boots sinking slightly in the soft dirt. She could feel her heartbeat, steady but fast. The silence pressed on her ears. Then she saw a door slightly ajar, a flicker of movement inside. "Contact," she whispered into her comm. The team froze. Daniels gestured for her to hold position. Slowly, they advanced. When they breached the door, what they found wasn't a cache of weapons or insurgents. It was a family. An old man, 2 women, and 3 children huddled in fear. The man raised his hands, shouting something in a language they didn't understand. Daniels cursed under his breath. Intel was wrong. Avery scanned the room again. No hostiles, just civilians. Emily lowered her weapon slightly. The children were crying. One of the women held a baby, its face streaked with dust. Emily's stomach twisted. They searched the house anyway, standard procedure. But when Avery opened a wooden crate in the corner, his expression changed. "Sir," he called. Daniels came over, eyes narrowing at the contents: ammunition, wrapped in cloth. The air went cold. The old man shouted again, desperate, shaking his head, pointing to the door. Emily couldn't understand the words, but she knew what he was saying. "It's not ours." Daniel's voice hardened. "They've been hiding weapons. They're collaborating." Emily stepped forward. "Sir, we don't know that. This could have been planted. Look at them, they're terrified." "Doesn't matter," Daniel snapped. "We report this. Command will decide what to do." The tension was thick enough to choke on. Emily glanced at the children, barefoot, trembling. She felt the weight of her rifle in her hands, a hum of adrenaline that never truly faded anymore. When they returned to base, Daniels filed his report. Hours later, orders came back. Detain the man for questioning, secure the property, and burn any contraband. Emily couldn't sleep that night. The image of the children screaming as soldiers dragged their father away replayed in her mind again and again. The next morning, she approached Daniels outside the command tent. "Sir, I need to talk about the farmhouse." He didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about." "With respect," she said, voice firm. "Those weren't insurgents. You saw the kids. That man wasn't fighting anyone." Daniels finally looked at her, his eyes tired but sharp. "You think I liked it? You think any of this is simple? We follow orders, Carter. That's how we stay alive." "Maybe," she said quietly. "But that doesn't make it right." He didn't answer. Over the next few weeks, the mood in camp changed. The locals stopped cooperating. Supply runs became riskier. They started losing translators, people too afraid to keep working with them. Whispers spread that the incident at the farmhouse had turned the nearby village against them. Then came the explosion. It happened one night, just as the sun disappeared beyond the dunes. A supply truck was returning from a routine route when it hit an IED, buried in the road. The blast shook the ground for miles. Emily and Avery were among the first to reach the site. The wreckage burned bright in the dark, black smoke curling into the sky. 2 soldiers were dead. A third screamed for help, pinned under twisted metal. Emily dropped to her knees, pulling debris away with her bare hands. Her gloves tore. Her skin burned. She could barely hear anything but the ringing in her ears. When they finally freed him, his leg was gone. Later that night, as she sat outside the medical tent, blood smeared on her sleeves, Avery approached and sat beside her. "They said it was the same route near the farmhouse," he said quietly. Emily stared into the distance, numb. "They're retaliating." Avery's voice cracked. "For what we did." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, she opened her notebook again. Her hands trembled as she wrote new names: Hughes, Morales. She didn't bother describing them this time. Words couldn't capture the weight anymore. Days turned into weeks. The guilt settled in her bones, heavy and unrelenting. She still followed orders, still fought, still did what was required. But something fundamental had changed. She no longer believed in the clean lines between right and wrong. Everything was a shade of dust. Then, one evening, Daniels called her into the command tent. His tone was softer than usual. "Carter," he said, "I've recommended you for promotion. You've earned it." She blinked. "A promotion?" "You've held your ground under pressure. You've led well. You deserve it." For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Promotion meant recognition, respect, but it also meant complicity, another step into a system she no longer fully believed in. "Thank you, sir," she said finally. That night, she stood by the fence, staring out at the endless horizon. The desert wind carried the faint echo of distant gunfire. She thought about her comrades, about the family in the farmhouse, about the choices that weren't choices at all. Avery found her there. "So, you're Sergeant Carter now," he said with a small grin. She didn't smile back. "Titles don't change much out here." He studied her. "You've changed, though." "I had to," she said. "We all had to." They stood in silence for a long time. Above them, the stars burned faintly, like fragile hopes refusing to die. When she finally went to sleep, Emily dreamed of Kansas, the wind, the wheat fields, the sound of her mother's voice calling her in for dinner. She woke before dawn, the dream dissolving into the low hum of the bass. War had a way of stealing everything: time, trust, innocence, but it couldn't take memory. Not yet. Emily strapped on her vest, checked her rifle, and whispered the same words she did every morning. Hold on. Just one more day. She didn't know it then, but the hardest part was still coming, the mission that would change everything once again, and the choice that would define who she truly was. The desert nights had grown colder, sharper, as though the wind itself had learned to whisper secrets through the tents. It had been months since the Farnhouse incident, and Emily could feel the weight of those days still buried under her armor. Even as she moved through the camp with the confidence of a newly promoted sergeant, part of her still carried the uncertainty of the recruit she once was. The soldiers under her command looked up to her now, not because she was loud or fearless, but because she never broke under pressure. She didn't shout when others panicked. She didn't falter when orders turned grim. They trusted her calm, even when she doubted it herself. One evening, just as the sun began to fall behind the distant ridges, Daniels called a meeting inside the operations tent. His expression was harder than usual, his tone clipped. "We've got a situation," he began. "Intel reports that one of our recon units went dark 3 hours ago. No comms, no signal. Last known position 5 clicks north, near the old oil refinery." The room fell silent. Everyone knew that area. It was hostile territory, crawling with enemy activity. Daniels looked around, his gaze settling on Emily. "Carter, you're leading the recovery team. We move at 040. Get your squad ready." Emily nodded. "Yes, sir." When she left the tent, the cold air hit her face, carrying the faint scent of sand and fuel. Avery caught up to her, adjusting his vest. "Guess we're heading into the lion's den again," he said, half smiling. "Guess so," Emily replied, her voice steady. But inside, unease coiled in her gut. Something about the mission felt wrong, too sudden, too quiet. Still, she prepared. Orders were orders. By dawn, the convoy rolled out 2 Humvees, 1 supply truck, and 6 soldiers, including Emily. Avery, Rodriguez, and Jenna. The desert stretched endlessly ahead. The sky a pale gray that promised another day of heat. The refinery appeared on the horizon like a mirage, rusted towers, broken pipelines, the remains of what once fueled a different kind of war. The place looked abandoned, yet the silence around it felt alive. "Eyes open," Emily ordered. "We sweep in pairs." They split into teams. Emily and Avery moved toward the northern side of the complex, rifles raised. Sand crunched beneath their boots. Every shadow seemed to breathe. Inside the main building, they found signs of struggled bullet holes in the walls, overturned crates, and a trail of blood leading down a narrow corridor. Avery's face tightened. They were here. Emily nodded, her throat dry. "Let's find them." They followed the trail until they reached a small room lit by a single flickering bulb. On the floor lay one of the missing soldiers, still alive, but barely. His uniform was torn, his face pale from blood loss. "Med kit," Emily shouted. Avery knelt beside him, pressing gauze against the wound. "He's been hit bad." The soldier's eyes fluttered open. "Ambush. They knew we were coming," he rasped. Emily's pulse spiked. "How? Who knew?" He shook his head weakly. "Someone. On the inside." His voice broke off before he could finish. "Stay with me," Emily urged, but his body went limp. A chill ran through her. An inside leak? That meant someone from their own camp had given away the recon unit's position. Before she could process it, gunfire erupted outside. "Contact!" Rodriguez's voice screamed through the comms. "Multiple hostiles, west side." Emily and Avery rushed out, bullets cutting through the air. Dust exploded around them as they dove for cover. Through the haze, silhouettes appeared, enemy fighters advancing fast. "Jenna, flank left." Emily shouted, returning fire. Explosions rocked the refinery. Metal groaned, flames burst from a ruptured pipe. The sky filled with smoke and chaos. Emily moved through it, like she'd been born there, focused, efficient, alive in the storm. But there were too many of them. A grenade detonated near the second Humvee, flipping it onto its side. The sound was deafening. Emily felt herself thrown backward, the world spinning in flashes of fire and static. When her vision cleared, Avery was lying a few feet away, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his sleeve. "I'm fine," he yelled, though his face said otherwise. Emily crawled toward him, dragging him behind cover. "We're pinned down." She called into the radio. "We need backup." Static answered her. Then silence. "Radio's jammed," Rodriguez said, breathless, his voice crackling through what little signal remained. Emily scanned the field. Too many enemies, not enough time. She took a deep breath. "We're not dying here." "Avery, can you still shoot?" He grinned weakly. "Wouldn't be the first time I bled on duty." "Good, then keep them off us." They fought for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, each second stretched thin by adrenaline and fear. Eventually, the gunfire began to fade. The attackers retreated as suddenly as they'd come, vanishing into the dunes. Emily waited, heart pounding, before finally signaling, "Cease fire." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. She checked her teen, Avery wounded but stable, Rodriguez limping, Jenna shaken but alive. They'd survived. But something was wrong. The ambush had been too precise. The attackers knew exactly where they'd be, when they'd arrive, and how to cut their coms. On the drive back to base, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the dying soldier's words. Someone on the inside. That night, Daniels debriefed them in private. "You did well, Carter," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But I need your report immediately. Everything you saw." Emily hesitated. "Sir, I think someone's leaking our mission details." Daniel's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," she said firmly. "It's a pattern. They knew we were coming. That doesn't happen by chance." He stood, his tone rising. "That's enough, Sergeant. You're exhausted. Get some rest." "That's an order." She saluted, but her jaw clenched. Something wasn't right, and she could feel it deep in her bones. Later that night, while the camp slept, she sat outside the communications tent, staring at the blinking light on the encrypted channel. The leak could be anywhere: an intercepted signal, a corrupted report, or someone in command. She thought of Daniel's reaction, his quick dismissal. It didn't fit the man she knew, the one who'd once told her leadership meant owning every mistake. Doubt gnawed at her. Avery limped over, his arm in a sling. "You're still awake," he said quietly. "I can't shake it," Emily replied. This wasn't random. He sat beside her. "You think Daniels knew?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But I'm going to find out." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the generators. The desert wind carried faint echoes from far-away voices, maybe, or just ghosts of the war that never really stopped. Finally, Avery spoke again. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Carry the world like it's your job." Emily smiled faintly, though her eyes were tired. "Somebody has to." When dawn came, she walked into Daniel's office with her notebook in hand. Inside were the names of the fallen, and beside them, a new word she'd written in the margins. Truth. She placed it on his desk. "If I find out someone's putting our people in danger, I'm not staying silent." Daniels met her gaze, unreadable. "Be careful, Sergeant. Sometimes the truth isn't what keeps you alive." She turned to leave, the desert sun spilling through the open flap of the tent. "Then I guess I'll have to learn how to live with that." As she stepped outside, the wind picked up, lifting dust into the air. The camp was waking, soldiers moving, engines rumbling, the day beginning again like nothing had changed. But Emily knew better. Something had shifted. And for the first time since she joined the army, Emily Carter wasn't just fighting a war on foreign soil. She was fighting one within her own ranks. The desert sun rose like a pale fireball, painting the sky in streaks of gold and ash. Emily watched it from the guard tower, her eyes hidden behind dark glasses, her mind still restless from the night before. She'd barely slept. Every thought kept circling back to the same unanswered question. Who sold them out? The refinery ambush hadn't been luck. Someone had fed the enemy their route, timing, and communication codes. Whoever it was had blood on their hands, blood from their own brothers and sisters in arms. She lit a cigarette, something she only did when the silence became unbearable. Below, the camp was waking. Soldiers moved like shadows, prepping gear, cleaning weapons, checking trucks. Life went on, as it always did after chaos. Avery climbed the ladder and joined her, his arm still in a sling. "You look like hell," he said. "I feel worse." He leaned on the railing beside her. "You think it's Daniels?" She hesitated. "He's hiding something. He's too calm. He shut me down the second I mentioned the leak." Avery frowned. "Could be someone higher up. Could even be Intel Command." "Maybe," she said, her tone sharp. "But someone here made that call." He didn't argue. He just stared out at the endless desert. "So what do we do?" Emily dropped the cigarette and crushed it under her boot. "We find proof." The next few days, she kept her suspicions quiet, moving carefully, listening more than she spoke. She watched people, how they reacted when the radios went down, when new orders came in. She began to notice patterns. Subtle, but there. Rodriguez always volunteered for comms duty, a little too eagerly. Jenna, who once laughed at everything, avoided eye contact whenever the ambush came up. Daniels had become more distant, spending long hours in the command tent on encrypted calls no one else was allowed to hear. Something was off. Then, one night, while most of the camp slept, Emily slipped into the communications tent. The low hum of the machines filled the air, the red glow of monitors casting long shadows. She moved quickly, opening the system logs. Most were encrypted, but one stood out, a transmission from 2 nights before. It was brief, unscheduled, and sent through an unauthorized channel. She traced the origin. Her stomach dropped when she saw the access code. It belonged to Captain Daniels. A rustle behind her made her freeze. "What are you doing here, Sergeant?" His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Emily turned slowly. Daniels stood in the doorway, half lit by the flickering screen. His face was unreadable, but his hand rested casually near his sidearm. "I could ask you the same thing, sir," she said, keeping her tone calm. He stepped closer. "You think you know what you're doing? Snooping through restricted systems?" "I think," she said steadily, "someone's been feeding intel to the other side. And I just found out who." For a moment, neither of them moved. The air was thick with tension. Then Daniels sighed, a sound that was almost weary. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Carter. Why?" She demanded. "Why would you do it?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out the tent flap toward the dark horizon. "You ever wonder what all this is for? The patrols, the reports, the bodies? You follow orders long enough, you start to realize half of them come from people who don't even know our names. They send us here, we fight, we die, and nothing changes." "That's not an excuse," Emily snapped. "You got people killed." Daniels turned back to her, his voice low but sharp. "You think I wanted that?" I made a deal to keep this camp safe. Information for peace. But command kept pushing us further, making targets out of civilians. I drew a line. You crossed it, she said, her voice trembling with anger. Daniels stared at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. You sound just like I did once. Before she could respond, the radio on his belt crackled. A panicked voice shouted through the static. Incoming fire from the North Ridge. We're under attack. The ground shook. Alarms blared across the camp. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the noise. Looks like we'll have to finish this later. He turned to leave, but Emily grabbed his arm. Not this time, she said, pulling her pistol. He froze, eyes narrowing. You really going to point that at your commanding officer? If it means stopping another ambush, yes. For a moment, she thought he might draw his weapon. But instead, he raised his hands slowly. Fine. Then you'd better decide fast, Sergeant. Because if we don't hold the line out there won't be anyone left to arrest. Outside, explosions thundered. The walls shook. Emily hesitated. She could hear soldiers shouting, gunfire rattling in the distance. Avery's voice echoed over the radio, calling for backup. She lowered her weapon slightly. If we make it out of this, you're answering for everything. Daniels nodded once. Fair enough. They rushed out together into chaos. The attack was massive, dozens of hostiles advancing from the dunes, mortar pounding the perimeter. The air burned with smoke and sand. Emily took cover behind a barricade, shouting orders to her squad. Hold the east flank. Keep the medics covered. She spotted Avery helping wounded soldiers to safety, his arm still strapped tight. Daniels barked commands on the other side, organizing a counterstrike. Despite everything, he fought like a man trying to make up for his sins. Hours felt like minutes. The night turned into a blur of light and sound tracer fire cutting through darkness, screams swallowed by explosions. Emily lost count of how many times she fired, reloaded, ducked, and rose again. At one point, a mortar struck near her position, throwing her to the ground. Her ears rang, vision spinning. Through the haze, she saw Daniels dragging a wounded soldier away from the flames. She crawled to her feet, coughing, and pulled her rifle up again. Avery, she shouted. I'm good. He yelled back, returning fire. But we're low on ammo. Then make it count. By dawn, the fighting began to fade. The remaining attackers retreated, leaving behind a scorched horizon and too many bodies. Emily moved through the wreckage, helping whoever she could. Her hands shook as she pressed bandages, carried stretchers, whispered to the dying. She found Daniels near the northern fence, slumped against a sandbag. Blood soaked through his uniform. Stay with me, she said, dropping beside him. He looked up at her, his breathing ragged. Guess. I finally paid for my mistakes. Don't talk like that, she said. We can get you out. He coughed, shaking his head. You were right, Carter. I crossed the line. I thought I could play both sides, keep the peace. But there's no peace in this place. Just choices that break you. His hand trembled as he reached into his vest and pulled out a small data drive. Proof, he whispered. Everything. The transmissions, the deals. Get it to command. Emily took it, her fingers closing around the metal. I will. Daniel's eyes softened. You're a better soldier than I ever was. She opened her mouth to answer, but his gaze had already gone, distant, fixed on something beyond her, something only he could see. She sat there for a long time, the sun climbing higher, painting everything gold. Around her, the camp burned. When Avery finally found her, she was still holding the drive. He's gone? He asked quietly. She nodded. What's that? Evidence, she said, standing slowly. Enough to end this. Avery looked at her, exhausted but resolute. Then let's finish what he started the right way. Emily slipped the drive into her pocket, her face set with determination. The recruit who once trembled under orders was gone. What remained was a soldier shaped by loss, loyalty, and the cruel truth of war. As the wind howled across the empty desert, Emily whispered to herself, "This time, we fight for more than survival." The war wasn't over, but for the first time, she knew exactly what she was fighting for. The plane descended slowly over the rolling plains of Kansas. Emily stared out the window, the horizon stretching endlessly in shades of green and gold. The sight of home should have been comforting, but instead it felt surreal, as if the land she remembered belonged to someone else, someone untouched by dust, death, and endless gunfire. Months of war had transformed her. Every step, every firefight, every loss had carved lines into her face, hardened her hands, and sharpened her instincts. She was no longer the eager recruit who had arrived at the base full of dreams and untested courage. She was a soldier tempered by fire, carrying scars that would never fully fade. When she landed, the airport felt like a strange limbo. Families hugged, children laughed, travelers hurried through glass corridors, oblivious to the wars fought thousands of miles away. Emily walked with her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, the weight of the last year pressing down with each step. Her mother was waiting. She looked older, softer, somehow smaller than Emily remembered. When Emily stepped into her arms, she felt the tug of everything she had buried, the fear, the grief, the exhaustion. She didn't cry at first. She just clung, letting herself be small for a moment. "Welcome home, Emily," her mother whispered. Home. The word felt strange on her tongue. Could it still belong to her after everything she'd seen? The first few weeks were disorienting. Simple things: coffee in the morning, sunlight streaming through the kitchen window. The hum of a lawnmower outside felt alien. Emily's hands shook when she held a mug, and the smell of fresh grass made her chest tighten. She couldn't sleep through the night without nightmares of explosions and gunfire. The faces of Ramirez, Cole, Lewis, and Daniels haunted her dreams, always just out of reach. Therapy sessions helped, but they were not magic. Sitting across from a counselor, recounting the horrors of firefights and betrayals, Emily realized that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about living with memory, about letting it guide her instead of paralyzing her. She started journaling again, this time not for training notes, but for memory. She wrote about the battles, the losses, the moments of courage and failure. She wrote the names of the fallen, the friends who had saved her, and those she couldn't save. Each page became a lifeline, a testament that none of it would be erased. Months passed. Emily returned to civilian life, but not entirely. She worked with veterans organizations, sharing her story, advocating for soldiers struggling with trauma, and helping families navigate the aftermath of deployment. Every meeting, every speech, every word reminded her that survival was not just about returning home, it was about carrying the weight of war responsibly. One afternoon, she visited the families of Ramirez and Cole. She brought pictures she had taken in the desert, snapshots of fleeting moments, smiles, laughter, even quiet reflections. She sat with them, telling stories that they would never hear from their loved ones themselves. Tears were shed, hands held, and for a moment, grief found company and understanding. It was exhausting work, but it was healing in its own way. Emily began to understand that courage wasn't just in the battlefield. It was in remembering, in speaking truth, in facing pain head-on. Evenings were the hardest. The silence of her apartment reminded her of the desert, the emptiness of the night, echoing the chaos she had lived through. But slowly, she carved out a routine. She cooked dinner, tended to her small balcony garden, and watched the sunset, the same sun that had risen over foreign sands countless times, now familiar, grounding. Then came the call she had been waiting for, the debrief from military intelligence about the data drive she had secured during the last mission. The leak inside their unit had been exposed, those responsible held accountable. Daniel's actions were reviewed, his motives debated, but the truth was finally acknowledged. Emily felt a small, bitter relief. Justice was never perfect, but at least it had begun to catch up. One evening, as she walked through the quiet streets of her hometown, Emily passed the old playground where she had once swung as a child. She stopped, leaning on the railing, staring at the empty swings moving slightly in the wind. For a moment, she let herself remember the carefree girl she had been before the uniform, before the firefights, before the deaths. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the cool autumn air filling her lungs. She could still feel the desert in her bones, the weight of loss and duty pressing against her chest. But she also felt something new, a flicker of hope, fragile but stubborn. Emily had been a recruit once, trembling under orders, uncertain of herself. She had survived ambushes, betrayals, moral quandaries, and unimaginable loss. She had carried the fallen, led the living, and endured the storms of combat both outside and within. And now, standing in the quiet of her hometown, she realized that survival wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. At night, she would often sit by the window, looking at the stars above, as she had countless nights in the desert. But this time, they felt different. They were not distant observers of her suffering. They were reminders of endurance, constancy, and the possibility of peace. She still carried scars, both seen and unseen. But she had also carried hope, courage, and a fierce determination to honor those she had lost. Each morning she woke. She chose to live not in spite of her memories, but alongside them, letting them shape her into someone who could continue to fight not on the battlefield, but in the world she had returned to. Emily Carter had begun as a recruit, untested and uncertain. The war had taken her comrades, challenged her morality, and forced her to confront the darkest parts of herself. But it had also revealed the resilience she never knew she possessed. As she walked home that night, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, she whispered their names one last time. Ramirez, Cole, Lewis, Daniels, the fallen, the broken, the brave. And then she whispered her own name, feeling its weight and promise. I survived, she said quietly, and I will carry forward. The wind rustled through the trees, a gentle, forgiving sound. Emily smiled faintly, feeling the quiet strength she had cultivated through chaos. She had returned to the world she had left behind, but she was not the same. And in that transformation, she found her true victory, not in battle, but in endurance, memory, and the courage to live fully once more. The desert and the war would always be a part of her, etched into her bones and her soul. But Emily Carter, once a trembling recruit, had emerged not broken, but steadfast a survivor, a witness and a guardian of memory. And as the night deepened, she finally allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that though war had taken much, it had not taken her entirely. She was home. She was whole enough to remember. She was enough to move forward. The story of Emily Carter, the recruit-turned-survivor, had reached its end, but the legacy of courage, loss, and resilience she carried would ripple through the lives of others, forever a testament to the cost and honor of service.